All right, so we're going to do an additive texture. So I'm starting off with a thinner slab now. This is my 1/4-inch slab that I rolled out. I didn't really allow it to dry out too much before I'm starting to work with it. It is bigger, much bigger than what I need, so that way I have space to kind of play around. So I'm going to start over on the side here, and anytime that you are adding clay together, if you just stick 2 pieces of clay together, even if they're relatively wet, they might not actually adhere to each other, like bits and pieces can fall off. So it's a really good idea to score your clay. And what you're going to do to score your clay, and how I like to score my clay, is that I actually will, so sometimes people have put, they'll take slip, which is just wet clay that's already like mushed up, and they'll put that on top of the piece. I actually like to build my slip into my clay by going over it several times with a rough brush or a scoring tool. So this time I'm using kind of a brush with about the texture of a, I'm going to think of a word, toothbrush. And then I go over it several times until I get a little bit of a paste. And that clay, because we've put water on it, is going to make it so that because we've broken it up, it's going to make it really open to accepting other clay. And as it starts to firm up and that water starts to go away, now that clay is kind of joined together, okay? So that's what we're looking for. And I'm taking pieces from like just little leftover bits from a previous tile and just putting those on because I'm thinking about how I want it to look like a succulent or some sort of texture to kind of go along with this general like theme. And in that process, I want to create like kind of a repetition, a pattern, something that's kind of building up. And so I can just take those pieces and start to like shove them on there. And I have a whole bunch of them, so I'm going to speed that process up so it doesn't take forever to watch this. But I just keep kind of adding. Now I'm going to try to add a little bit more variety within my texture in that now I'm just taking like strips of clay and adding that on and thinking along the lines of like, well, maybe I want to like make it a little bit stronger of a texture, something with a little bit more variety in it. And I'm like, so this is still not quite doing it for me, so I'll try some little squiggles. And honestly, I'm just not on board with it. So it's a disappointment. I don't know. I don't really like it. So I'm going to start over. And that is the glory. If it's not going the way that you want to go, stop. Work on something else. I always have the strong opinion that if it is working better, like if things aren't improving over time, um, then maybe it's time to either like take a break, move on to something else, or abandon and try something else. So I'm just going to play around, and I'm scoring this up again. And actually, I'm actually starting to really like the patterns that are coming out of this. So maybe I can create something using that. I do these, when I'm working on these tiles, I really do think about them in terms of a form of like play and experimentation. I don't go into it with like a really strong idea about what it is that I'm going to make. I go into it more along the lines of like I have my kind of starting image and the thing that I'm interested in with like a generalized goal. Otherwise, it's just going to be play and we'll see what we got. So I'm really liking this, but I think I want to try it out with a bigger brush and let's see if I can make some bigger texture, which I do like this. And again, these are just really stiff brushes, but it's starting to remind me about like moss and stuff. And I love myself some moss and some lichens, maybe even a couple little ferns. So it has a lot of like texture to it. So this is going to be my image. Now this is the image that I'm like kind of thinking about. And my question to myself is like, okay, this is kind of interesting. Maybe I can create like a little like pattern or something on here that I like. We'll try a circle. Maybe if I go the other way, it'll be better. Because I'm trying to see what that residual pattern is going to look like. And that's a little bit better, but it's still too flat. It's like, kind of looks like one of those like nautical seashells or something like that. And that is not the texture I'm going for. So let's add more clay. So I'm dipping some clay. I'm just jamming a ball of clay, squishing it around in my hands, and I'm just going to glob it on there. Let's see how that looks. We'll stab that some more. All right, now we're getting somewhere. I'm kind of excited about this little texture, which you might look at this and you're like, oh my God, Laura, that just looks like blob on top of blob, which the answer is yes. Blob on top of blob is, I think, what I'm going for. Because when I'm looking over at my picture of my moss, and this is an important thing, is kind of have a bunch of reference pictures that you're sort of interested in. It's not that you have to make things look exactly like that, but it is a really good idea to start to get some kind of points of inspiration for kind of a reference. So I like these textures, and I like adding on these more of these textures. So let's just keep going along with that general theme. And again, if it's something that you're excited about, then you should continue working on it. If it's something where you're starting to lose like excitement about it, then maybe try something else. Because again, the most important part about this process is to play. I'm actually starting to even really like the pieces that I'm not like squishing down. Like they have a little bit of prettiness to it too. So the more I can just kind of put things on, squish it down, and see how I can kind of even it out so it doesn't just look like, blobs that I put on there with zero purpose or intention. I think the difference between intention and accidental is consistency. I do want to fill my entire tile. Okay, so I don't want to just have like little sections of texture. And I'm not trying to create like a full on like scene. I'm not trying to do exactly what I have my image of. I'm just thinking like when I'm thinking about, so I'm going for kind of like, I think it's gonna be soft. It could be, maybe I consider it like maybe a little bit fluffy or fuzzy. Um, and so when I think about like kind of fuzzy, I think about going into the forest and all of the moss that's like if you've ever been in the forest in Washington, where it's just dripping with a whole bunch of moss, and if you're walking over the forest floor, you just kind of squid like it feels like a pillow. So that's kind of like what I think of in this process. So I'm very excited about where this is going. And as long as we continue to have, again, if you have excitement, you're doing the right thing. If you're doing it and you're like, it just isn't doing it for me, then it's not the right thing. Try something else. You can change your mind so many different times, and it'll be fine. I do want to fill in all of these edges. So let's just check and see if I'm hitting that 4-inch like mark. So I want to overfill so that way I can kind of cut it down. So that way it's going all the way to the edges. Again, I don't want you to be making a sculpture in the middle of your tile. I want you to fill your tile with the texture. And just play with different ways that you can start to put clay on here. I would encourage you to play with really wet clay. I would encourage you to play with the slip that I put into your little care packages. I would encourage you to dry out your stuff. I mean, honestly, guys, go find random stuff in your studio or your house. Your studio, your house. Now that you have like an art project going on in your house, you have a studio in your house. Congratulations. Um, so just go find random stuff to start jamming in the clay. You got a cat? Get your cat to walk over it. Got a dog? Get your dog to walk over it. Got, I don't know, look in the bottoms of your shoes. Go find some rocks and jam that into clay. Anything that you can honestly jam into the clay is a good way to go. This is about experimentation. It is not about you creating mimicking exactly what I'm doing. I mean, if you're into it, go for it. If you mimic me, that's fine. I do not care. Honestly, that is where a lot of artists start. Like, that's how you learn, is that you start off by just kind of mimicking and copying people, and then you start to, and one, you realize that your stuff isn't going to be the same. Two, and if it is, like, congratulations, you're an expert. Um, and the other thing that you start to realize is that you start to figure out what your own style is in that process of mimicking. So that is cool too. So when I talk about mimicking for myself, I like to mimic nature a lot. So that is my general like starting point for inspiration. Um, and when you're looking at these different textures that I'm asking you guys about, like so fuzzy or soft or water or rocky or anything like that, I want you to find that image that you feel kind of represents that for you. And see if that's starting to, like, if you are able to create a texture like that. Don't get too attached to anything that you're working on. You get too attached, and then, like, things, because guys, things are going to go wrong, and it's not going to work out. And it's not a waste of time for you to put these on. So now I'm going to like add a couple of little variations into my texture to create a little bit more points of interest. So I'm adding like some parts that I'm not going to like fuzz up. And I'm also starting to add little, I'm going to call them noodles or snakes or curvy spiky things. I don't know, just things. It doesn't have to, I'm not asking you to necessarily be realistic to what is there, but I am definitely asking you to make it so that it is conveying that feeling, of like, so if you, it's because we are creating a visual texture. It shouldn't be a drawing. It should definitely be, we're either dealing with additive or subtractive or like fully sculpting out a form and moving that clay around. And don't create a scene, but create a full, like fill that entire tile with your piece. So again, if you're thinking about like, oh, I want to do the woods, don't just draw some pictures of trees on a slab. Like, this isn't a drawing class, this is a sculpting class. This is a hand building class. And I do think that hand building really lends itself well to kind of sculpting techniques. And the other thing that I'm thinking about when we're working on this is these are potential things that we can add to our future projects. This is also going to be, these tiles are also going to be the thing that you can potentially that not potentially, that you will be using as sort of test tiles for your glazes and seeing how that works. For my beginning students, like, you guys are just experiencing glaze firsthand, and there's going to be some glazes that you put on and it's just going to obliterate your texture, which is going to be a note to self and also a learning point. So not a failure, totally a success. If you learn something from it, it's a success, okay? Um, so and then for my more advanced students, you guys are going to have a better idea about how glazes are going to interact with these textures. So keeping that in mind to actually incorporate those glazes into your overall process. So where something might not look totally like it's like the texture that you want it to be until you get the glaze on it, that's totally cool. But again, my beginning students, like, that is a whole other level. For my intermediate and advanced students, I am looking a little bit more towards how well you incorporate your glazes, your slips, and your colors into what it is that you're trying to create. Because color can totally add to what, like, so if I go back and I make this like a nice like green and kind of maybe some matte greens, maybe I'll add a little bit of gloss here and there as a highlight. That I think will really lend it, and maybe give myself some little like brown undertones in the cracks and crevices. And I can do that with underglazes and with stains, but also even just a little bit of gloss in some elements to give it a kind of a wet look. That's going to really lend itself to creating that illusion of mossy texture, right? So mossy and fuzzy, I feel like go together really well because, oh my gosh, have you guys ever felt moss? It's so fuzzy. It's so soft. I love it. But anyways, you can tell I'm getting excited about that sort of stuff. And that's kind of the difference. Like I'm way more, you can see my excitement between these two things. Like clearly I like the second texture more than I liked the first texture. It's just going better. And I also like me talking about it. I'm way more excited. And that's the thought process and the feelings that you have during your creation process really does show up in your end result. So if you're sitting there and you're like, this is boring and I hate it, chances are the thing you're going to make is boring and I will hate it too. I mean, I don't know. Sometimes you guys are way harder on yourself than I ever would be. So worst case scenario, guys, default to where I am. Um, and if I'm like, oh yeah, it's good, then it's good. So I'm gonna check this out and let's see if I have like filled up my space appropriately. And yeah, it's looking good. I think I'm ready to start actually cutting out my shape. So I sculpted the whole thing first and now I'm gonna cut. So I made my little line. I'm gonna try to make a straight-ish line because this time I don't wanna put my ruler over the top. So I made a sort of straight line. And I can fix that just by taking the ruler and kind of tapping it against it. And because this is still a relatively like wet piece, so this isn't leather hard at all. And I can kind of clean up those edges. Now I'm gonna make a mark over here. That's my 4-inch part, and then I'll make a mark over here to do my 4-inch like measurement, which my ruler totally doesn't want to like help me out right now. So there's my 4-inch there. Now I'm going to attempt to draw a straight line from one to the other, and I'm not going to panic if it's not perfect. Slowly, slowly, slowly. Yay! I cut a thing. And I'm using my needle tool to cut. Generally, if I'm working with anything that is wet or a soft leather hard, needle tool is a great way to go to do your cuts. If you are working with something that is leather hard or a stiff leather hard, then using your X-Acto knife is actually a much better way to cut. Okay, so now I need to get my other 4-inch mark. We'll stare at my head for a second because that's helpful. There we go. I made my line. It's not too bad. And I can again use my ruler. Because it's so soft, I can use this to kind of cut and make it into a square. Remember, guys, I really am going to be judgy about whether or not you actually made a square or if you made some sort of weird rectangle parallelogram like nonsense. Okay, so aim for a square. The thing you have to remember is that if it is soft like this, you can move it around. So if you pick it up and it gets distorted, put it back into the right spot. Okay, we'll cut this edge. Do. Okay, that's looking pretty squarish. Check all of my sides and I'm pushing in the edges. So great, I went underneath there. And now we can kind of look at some of that texture. Maybe you can see it a little bit better. Ooh, I'm super excited about my little texture there. So yay, we made a thing.